First thing she did was go for her son, as you might imagine. She couldn't get to him in his bedroom because the fire had progressed. So she ran out in her bare feet and her nightgown to get help. She brought a neighbor back. They tried to break through the window of the bedroom where her son was, Tony. The air went in, the trailer home went up, whoosh, and no one could get in there. The firefighters, when they were able to make their way in there, they found Tony, and he was on his bed and he was deceased. Within a couple hours, the investigators had decided that this was an arson fire. They saw a gasoline can on the steps to her trailer. That made them think it was arson. It was later determined that there was no gasoline used in the fire. It was a gas can used for a lawnmower, but that didn't stop them. They decided that it was an arson. She was the only one there. As we put it at trial, two of them were in the trailer home. She got out alive. She must have set the fire. And so she spent 13 years of her life in prison. No, I take it back, 16 years, excuse me. And she was recently released last year when we were able to bring out new evidence showing that the so-called science that the fire investigators have relied on in determining that there was arson has been completely debunked since then. And in fact, we also brought a different expert who established that what had actually happened was that there was a smoldering fire in the wall or the ceiling of her son's bedroom, probably as a result of faulty wiring. Clearly a smoldering, that type of fire is not an intentional fire, and that he died from smoke inhalation as a result of that situation. So she was released last year and the charges were dropped at the end of the year. Sad, horrifying cases, difficult to work on, but no comparison to the folks that had to live through it. And whoops, I didn't even go through my little slides about my different clients. But anyway, having worked through those cases, we just had to ask ourselves, are these types of cases typical of women's cases? And so what we've done since we started the project is we've made great use of a resource called the National Registry of Exonerations. And it's a database of wrongful convictions. You can, I didn't bring a slide for it, but you can Google it, Exoneration Registry. And it's a joint project of the CWC, my organization, and the Law School of Michigan. And it catalogs every known exoneration since 1989 in the United States. Right now, there's over 1,200 exonerations in there, which is a pretty big number, and it grows every day because I don't think they have everybody in there yet. And so we use that kind of as our starting point for thinking about all wrongful convictions and specifically women's wrongful convictions. So one of the things that leaps out when you look at that database is how few women have been exonerated. So we have over 1,200 exonerations, and only 92 of them to date are women's cases. That's under 8%. So you think about that, and you think, well, maybe that's explainable because we all know that not as many women are arrested for crimes as men, and not as many are convicted as men. But in fact, the most recent statistics on arrests for women is that they're arrested, that 25% of arrests are for women. But I think the number's been going up every year. The statistics I find on how many women are convicted in comparison to men is that somewhere between 16 and 18% of felony convictions in state courts are women. So if you assume, as I do, that there's probably not a great difference between the rate of wrongful convictions among convicted women and convicted men, what this is telling us is that women are underrepresented in the exonerations. So just to repeat that, 16 to 18% of women, or 16 to 18% of the individuals convicted of felonies are women, but only 7.6% of the individuals exonerated to date have been women. Now I don't know, are there any statistics people out there, statistics majors? Or, Sherry, I'm sure. And I mean, I realize this is a very small sample, and perhaps it's not statistically significant, but these are the numbers we have. And I do think that women are underrepresented in the exonerations, and I have some ideas online. And here's the first one. And that is that DNA, I'm sure you've heard of DNA exonerations, DNA cases, DNA evidence. The DNA revolution pretty much jump-started the work that I do in innocence and wrongful conviction work. And the way that happened is that we got this science of DNA where we can now look at certain bodily fluids and we can tell to a virtual certainty whether or not they came from a certain individual. And that's pretty good. And once that science started being applied to certain old cases, we found that for the first time that you could scientifically show that certain people had been wrongfully convicted. And the most easiest, most obvious example would be a sexual assault, where the perpetrator left behind evidence from his body, and the police saved it. You could test it, and you could compare it to the suspect, and you could see whether or not that suspect contributed that sample, if you know what I mean, without getting too graphic. What we learned, and what people learned for the first time, police and attorneys and prosecutors, was that, wow, really, sometimes people are really convicted of something they didn't do. And not only that, but in some of the cases where it turned out through DNA testing that the wrong person had been convicted, it turned out that the defendant had confessed to the crime. But yet scientifically we knew he hadn't committed the crime. And that stunned people. And likewise, you had cases where a witness got on the witness stand, an eyewitness to the crime, and said, I saw that defendant do this crime. And then it turned out through the DNA testing, that person hadn't done it. And that was startling. The problem is, again, for reasons without getting too graphic that are perhaps obvious, a lot more men's cases than women's cases can be solved with DNA evidence. And most of the sexual assault cases can't be solved, most of the sexual assault cases are not women's cases. So the numbers here, you've got almost a third of exonerations of men's cases are in DNA type cases, but a very tiny number of women's cases can be solved by DNA. And actually that 8% it overrepresents the number. There's a different list at the Innocence Project in New York, which is keeps track of all the DNA cases. They keep their own list. And this number is based on 7 women's cases having been overturned as a result of DNA, but the Innocence Project in New York says it's only 4. So that would be like 4%. So to sum that up, the DNA revolution has been great for criminal justice. It has exposed the fact that people do get wrongfully convicted, but in terms of actually exonerating people, it's left women behind. And that's one reason why the exoneration is left behind. Another thing we found, and I don't know that this goes to explaining why women are underrepresented in exonerations, but it's a pretty startling statistic also. And that is that approximately 2/3 of the women who've been exonerated to date in the U.S. Were convicted in cases where there actually was not a crime. So think about that. I've given you one example. That was Christine Bunch. I talked about her at the beginning. Her son died as a result of an accidental fire, but she was convicted of murder. And that explains a lot of the women, and I'd say 2/3 of the women's cases, 18% of the men's cases. I mean, that's really the crazy part. So you need to think about why that is. But a lot of these cases are caretaker cases, cases where the woman was maybe the mother, the babysitter, the daycare worker, and the person in her care died accidentally or from natural causes or for an illness, but the woman was blamed and was convicted of an intentional crime. In fact, there was no crime. Another type of situation is really just false allegations of crime. And back in the 80s, maybe even the 70s, but certainly the 80s, there were waves in different areas of the country where in different communities, people would start thinking that there were rings of people that were committing child sexual abuse. And once that idea took hold in a community, all of a sudden scores of children would be coming forward and saying pretty much every adult that they were ever around had sexually abused them. And dozens of men and women were scooped up in these prosecutions and convicted. And then later, after better experts looked at the evidence and talked to the kids, they realized that the abuse hadn't happened at all.